from a fallout shelter somewhere under Seattle, Washington. It's the show you've been waiting for. Get ready to join your hosts, John and Kenric, as they talk comics, movies, and more. Now here's Spoiler Country!
Hey, if you're listening to our show for the first time and you're on one of the social medias that we're on, like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, any of those kinds of things, you should always check us out on scpod.net. But if you want to keep up with our latest episodes, you should bring out your smartphone, get into your favorite podcatcher, find Spoiler Country, and hit subscribe. Then you'll get all our new stuff.
And if you want to reach out to us, you can do that in two ways. You can call us, leave us a voicemail at 707-656-2080. Again, 707-656-2080. Or you can shoot us an email at spoilercountry@gmail.com.
United Armies of the Spoilerverse, welcome back to Spoiler Country. I'm Kenric, and that is Johnny Horsley, or Mr. Horsley, as I usually say.
Right, or just John.
Or John, or Jay, or
JN.
That guy over there.
Yeah.
And today on the show, it's Simon Spurrier.
It is.
And he is the new writer. Or is it new? Not new writer. He's been doing it for a while.
No, he's new.
He's new.
New book. New release of this book.
New release of this book. He's the new writer with the new version of Hellblazer with DC Comics. So are they pulling Constantine out of the DC continuity with this?
I think, but isn't he still in Justice League Dark, though?
Yeah, he is in Justice League Dark.
So I don't know.
He tends to be the leader of Justice League Dark.
Yeah, I think there's probably going to be two.
It's a multiverse.
Yeah, why not?
It doesn't really matter.
Whatever, it's cool.
Yeah.
It's cool. But yeah, Casey.
Yeah, our man on the street,
Casey
T. Allen.
Casey Tickle Monster Allen, yeah.
Yep, or Tickle Man.
Whatever.
Depending on
just Tickle.
What multiverse you're in right now.
Right, exactly. I'm in the Tickle Man or the Tickle Monsterverse. Casey said he had a great time with talking with him, and I had scheduled to have it with me on there, but it didn't work out. So Casey stepped in and did it for us.
Simon's over in jolly old England.
Yeah.
And so Casey
time difference.
Got on at 2 a.m. our time.
2 a.m. our time, 4 a.m. Casey's time.
To have this discussion, which is amazing.
And I was actually awake when this started, but I was going to bed, and
so I looked at the clock at 1:30 a.m. I'm like, if I stay up for 30 minutes, I could join this interview.
Yeah.
And then I turned over, and it was 7:30 in the morning.
I messaged Casey. I was like, "Hey man, I'm awake, but I'm going to bed. Good luck." I was so tired.
I didn't even do that. I just sleep. But anyways, why don't we just get into this and hear Simon in his own words?
Here we go.
Okay, welcome again to another episode of Spoiler Country. My name is Casey Allen, and today I'm joined by Si Spurrier. He is the writer of, among other things, X-men, and which is they're bringing back John Constantine. So, Si, how you doing, man?
Very good, very, very good. A little in desperate need of coffee, but otherwise very good. Thank you.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna crank that up as soon as we get off. I'd considered making some hot tea or something, but I was just running around like crazy to try and find my headphones.
It's only fair to mention that Casey has done me the great privilege of waking up at 4:30 a.m. to hear me out here because the time difference is so punishing. So you are being hosted by a hero today.
It's nothing, man. So yeah, you were handpicked to write this new iteration of John Constantine. Can you tell us a little bit about that? We'll just jump into it.
Sure. So to trek back a few steps, about 5 years ago, a call went out to various writers saying that DC Vertigo, as it then was intending to do something, and it was all a bit vague, to do with the Sandman IP, and with Neil Gaiman's connivance, they were looking for writers to pitch kind of satellite titles And at the time, I was very busy and disgustingly arrogant, and perhaps neither of those things has changed in 5 years. But rather than thinking to myself that I could pitch just one satellite title, I said, well, you know what? If I'm going to pitch anything, I'm going to pitch for the whole damn event. And I sent them this extremely ambitious outline, which sort of took over the whole idea. And I expected to hear nothing back, and frankly, it all just sort of seemed to go away. So I assumed that I had shot my load and kind of failed miserably there. But looking back at it now, with the benefit of inside knowledge, I think it was just that the wheels were turning and the legalities were being sorted out. And 5 years later, it kind of came back, and this time round, it came in the form of what they eventually called the Sandman universe, which was a collection of titles which picked up on certain threads that Neil had created in his Sandman mythos. And Neil felt like, without leaning into the story of the Sandman itself, there were an awful lot of things left to be said in that world, and he handpicked 4 writers, myself included, to kind of do, well, frankly, whatever we wanted. You know, we assumed originally that we'd be very much borrowing his toys and doing the whole thing under his watchful and directive eye. But in fact, what we discovered was that he just sort of let us treat the toys as if they were our own. So that was the dreaming in my case, and it used an awful lot of the stuff that I had originally pitched all those years ago. And just as the point was approaching, excuse me, that a lot of the really heavy thematic stuff that I had pitched in that original idea was kind of coming to its natural conclusion in my run for the dreaming, I had a call scheduled with Neil, and I expected it to be the usual extremely avuncular, very generous, and extremely incisive set of notes to do with my work on the dreaming. And instead, I found him on a video call sitting next to my editor and my editor-in-chief. And I was sort of, so what do you think of the latest episodes? And have you got any notes for me? And they said, well, actually, sir, we wanted to talk to you about something else today. And it transpired that they had all been itching to get Hellblazer, John Constantine, back in a sort of mature content title. Neil had this idea for how we might go about doing that in such a way that it kind of reconciled all of the characters' extremely tangled continuity. And they wanted me to do it. And my jaw hit the ground, and a huge privilege, and by the way, not a little bit intimidating. But yeah, it sort of felt like, it was odd. It felt like a strange combination of great privilege and almost, it's about fucking time. Do you know what I mean? But by that, I have to qualify that. But when you're coming up in comics, especially if you like a certain breed of mature content horror, especially if you like a small circle of very well-regarded writers, and I'm thinking of the likes of the Ennises and the Ellises and the Morrisons and the Delanos and the Azzarellos of the world, all these kind of luminaries in our industry, and especially if you're British, you can't help but have been influenced by all these extraordinary stories told about this character over the years. And frankly, I always felt like it was almost inevitable that the time would come when I got my chance to write the character. And when the book folded after issue 300, I was a little bit heartbroken. I sort of assumed that I was never going to get my chance, and I just kind of put away all of those ideas I'd been stewing for years and assumed that it would never happen. So this was like a bolt out of the blue, but at the same time felt kind of like coming home. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, totally. And, I mean, Constantine has been through so much shit. There's no way they could have kept him down for that long. I mean, then again, didn't it end in, like, 2013?
It's been a while.
Yeah.
And, I mean, to tell you stuff I'm sure you already know, what they tried to do, with some success, was to incorporate the character into the kind of mainstream DC universe. Now, my view is that the version of John who's been running around in the DCU has accumulated to himself some really great stories and been handled really, really well, but it is not the same version of the character as I grew up reading. And that is not to say that one is better or worse than the other, simply that the sorts of stories that I associate with the character and the sorts of stories I wanted to tell about the character probably would struggle to be told in the context of the DC universe, partly because of the restriction on mature content, partly because of the kind of in-world realities of that universe. And so the challenge and the joy has been to find an excuse to bring John back to a version of our world, which in this particular case we are somewhat euphemistically calling the Sandman universe, because that really doesn't mean anything. It just means a grown-up world which is recognizably our own, with a layer of magic and mystery just under the surface.
So are you going to be able to go as hard as the guys back in the day did with Constantine? Are you are they giving you much restriction with the character, or are you able to just kind of do with it as you will?
Exactly the latter. They've sort of encouraged me to go as hard and as fast as possible. There are obvious common sense things you can't do, and I'll give you an example. In the first issue, well, no, let me go back 2 steps again. We've got 2 first issues in the field here, and that's one of the strange idiosyncrasies of comics, is that nothing can go out unnumbered. So in October, we released a 38-page one-shot, which rejoiced in the nice, short, easily digestible title, Sandman Universe Presents Hellblazer #1, which is, nice and concise. It was really just a sort of one-shot and a special issue with art by Marcio Takara, and the whole point of that was to identify and then execute a means of choosing which version of John we like and bringing him back to our world, and that happened in this special, which ran in October. So today, the day that we are recording this interview, being November the 27th, is the day that the new ongoing series starts with a new #1. And I worry endlessly that readers will think that because there are 2 #1s side by side, they don't need to read them both. But they are not the same thing. So today is when the ball really gets rolling, and you don't need to have read the special to enjoy today's new #1, but it won't hurt. Anyway, the point of the new #1 today is to drop John back into a recognizable context. He's in London.
And he literally gets dropped within the first couple of pages.
Yeah, right.
And it is fabulous.
The trick, the thing that I think differs from the last round of Hellblazer is that whereas in the past, I am coming to your point with this, don't worry, this is a classic Simon Spurrier waffle where I come at an answer through 4 sides of a pentagram. But, he would normally have access to an endless list of friends and acquaintances and lovers to help him out of any situation. And that's no longer the case. He's functionally alone. And to deal with that, he does what anybody like himself, by which I mean a sort of manipulator and a person who requires validation from friendships in order to distract himself from the horrible shit that goes on in his brain. He does what anybody like that would do, which is to try and collect people. And the way he does that is to stand in a pub and tell filthy jokes until somebody laughs. And as you refer, he fails miserably and in fact gets thrown out of the pub. But the trick was, what joke does he tell? Now, it needs to be a funny joke. It needs to be an offensive joke, because in 2019, telling an offensive joke probably will get you thrown out of the pub, because we no longer have much toleration for political incorrectness, and that's as it should be. But it also needs to be a joke that is not so offensive, or at least not specifically offensive enough, in such a way that it makes our hero appear to be a racist or a misogynist or a homophobe or any of the things that we really don't want him to be. It just needs to be an ill-judged joke. And so to circle right back to your question, how far am I allowed to go? I could have told all sorts of really disgusting jokes. And actually we went through multiple versions of what joke we tell. And we kind of always decided that they were always just a little bit too offensive to a particular group or a particular demographic to really get away with it. So the joke we eventually settled on, I think it's very funny and I think it's very John, but it sort of doesn't really insult anybody except for members of the royal family. And you know what? Fuck them. So... So yeah, to answer your question in a slightly less egregiously long-winded way, I have been encouraged to go as hard and as fast as I can, but within the bounds of common sense and without trying to taint our character by association.
Oh yeah. And I've read through issue 1. Right off the bat, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm buying this entire run. This is
great.
Fantastic. So you have one guy about 30 minutes outside of Birmingham, Alabama, that will be there. So
I hope you are not alone. It's funny, Hellblazer is one of these titles that everybody who loves comics loves it and loves the character, and everybody's kind of got their favorites. And strangely enough, John Constantine is one of those characters that comic book creators all want to write. I can't tell you the number of my friends and peers who have congratulated me on this gig through gritted teeth because they're so steamingly envious. But whether or not it sells as well as it ought, as well as it deserves, I do not know. Remains to be seen.
He seems to be one of the guys, whether he's in universe or not, that just kind of in like the mainstream DC universe or not, that just kind of sees through the bullshit.
Yeah.
So you can't pull one over on him.
It's really funny. I mean, this is generalizing horribly, but I think it speaks somewhat to a basic distinction between the sort of British cultural mentality and the American cultural mentality. As a British guy, I find it extremely difficult to deal with anything unadulterated. So earnest expressions of sentiment or emotion, the instinct is immediately to follow them up with an insult or something like that, because we're not very comfortable around those sorts of open and honest expressions. So for somebody like John, being in a context of heroes, for instance, superheroes, he would immediately be suspicious of them, because in his worldview, like in mine, it's almost impossible to imagine somebody being that good, that selfless and altruistic, without some sort of ulterior motive. Now, whereas that cynical attitude plays very well in the UK, I think it also can be exported to an American audience, because everybody kind of enjoys seeing hot air being deflated and barbs and arrows being flung at their glowing saintly characters. Whereas I'm not sure it works so well in the other direction. Historically, the superhero as a sort of glowing paragon of saintliness doesn't play quite so well in my particular suspicious, cynical, emotionally constipated country as it does in yours. So,
why do you think that is?
I mean, I could bore you. That's a question for a pub. My suspicion, and again, this is wretched generalization, is that it comes from having in the British cultural psyche the DNA of growing up in a faded, post-imperial kind of pseudo-socialist society where the government is always looking after you and you can't fuck up without being picked up off the ground. And it means that we are always content to look for a secondary meaning, to look for an ulterior motive. Whereas my suspicion is that, again, generalizing, if you were able to go digging in the quintessential American psyche, you would come up against the singular notion that any person can stand alone and really, ultimately, you can't rely on anybody but yourself, which is not how we are raised in the UK. And so the idea of the hero as paragon of strength and judgment, and as a sort of aspirational archetype, I think plays quite neatly with the American psyche in a way that it doesn't always with the British psyche. But look, this is a way bigger conversation.
So, do you mind asking? Do you mind if I ask about Epiphany? Is she going to be back in this version of Hellblazer, or is that has that came and went?
In my current plans, no. I have no intention of bringing that back, which is not the same as saying I don't value those stories. I do. I think they're good stories. It's just that for a host of reasons, some of them commercial, some of them creative, I wanted to start afresh. I wanted to find a way that allows us to assume this is a John Constantine that we know and love, and he's got a head full of memories. We might quite cheerfully assume that he has lived all the lives that we have seen him living, but in order to avoid any complications, in order to make it so that readers don't need to feel like they have to leap over 1,000 continuity hurdles to understand what they're reading, we wanted to start afresh, and hence, I mean, I was saying this before, this idea of him for the first time being alone, not having anybody to rely upon, that's quite an interesting take on a character who has always been surrounded by friends, lovers, acquaintances, and who is extremely good at accidentally throwing them under the bus. So I kind of wanted to know what happens when he finds himself utterly isolated, and how he goes about rebuilding a circle, and whether he is still just as likely to betray and destroy the people who are stupid enough to trust him, or whether he's learnt any lessons. So yeah, the Epiphany thing, I think it's probably in his memory. This is again a slightly larger issue, but I feel like comic book fans in particular are extremely sophisticated in how they pass the concept of continuity in history. For instance, you can be a Batman fan and you can read 5 different books every month, and you don't stop and get your knickers in a twist over the fact that he's in like 3 different teams, and in one book he's on the moon, and in another book he's spent a month investigating a crime in New Delhi or whatever. You know what I mean? You have the sophistication to say, I'm going to enjoy these stories on their own merits, and maybe there's 1 or 2 people who are so obsessive about it that they need somebody to explain to them how the connective gristle makes all these things possible in continuity, and maybe there's a way of doing that, maybe there isn't, but most of us just enjoy the fact that this is the same recognizable character living through different stories. And so it is, I think, with John Constantine. I think that if I really had to, I could sit down and draw you an extremely complicated timeline which makes clear exactly what memories are in his head and how he got to where he is and all of that stuff. But it doesn't matter, because if you are a fan of the character who needs to believe that he went through all those stories with Epiphany and with Kit and with all the other things that you can go and hunt down, and great stories, then you can. If instead you want to believe that you don't really know very much about this guy and you're just going to dive into his adventures today and enjoy them, you can do that too. So yeah, that's a really abstract and annoyingly writery answer to the question.
Okay, so no plans for a Powers of Constantine, House of Constantine book to come out at the same time? Yeah. So do you mind if I ask a little bit about world building? Like you have just a ton of stuff already with Constantine that you can work with or not, but did you do anything specifically to kind of help you get into this world?
Not really. I mean, a lot of people have wondered how much we intend to make him a product of the Sandman universe. The answer is not very. Neil's contribution was to give us the play. This is where it all gets a bit complicated, and I'm sort of desperate to avoid complication because it makes readers worry that they need to have hit all these beats, and they really don't. But to give you a nice little tour of the concept behind all this, in 1991, Neil Gaiman wrote a miniseries called The Books of Magic, and the idea of that was to kind of establish once and for all how magic works in the DC universe. And it revolved around this little kid, a guy called Timothy Hunter, who was sort of destined to grow up to be the greatest magic user of all time. And the question was, is he going to grow up to be a decent guy, or is he going to be a monster? And in the course of that story, Timothy Hunter visits various different futures. And in one of those futures, he comes across a magical war, the last apocalyptic magic war of the age. And he encounters an older, grislier, very tired, very cynical John Constantine, who has been mortally wounded, who's lying in the wreckage of this war, incredibly bitter, waiting to die. And by the way, this magical war, it transpires, is being caused by an older version of Timothy Hunter, which is sort of giving credence to the fear that he will indeed grow up to be a monster. So Neil correctly identified that if you have a character like Constantine, which is just riddled with continuity contradictions and complexities, wouldn't it be great if you could just zoom in on a particular version of that character and say, all right, well, this is the one we want. This is the one that kind of typifies all the experience and emotion that we want out of our character. And then if we can find a way to pick him up and drop him back into our real world, then away we go. And that version of John, the one who is sitting there in the wreckage of that magical war dying, is the one that we chose. And so that is the story in the special, the one shot I mentioned before, which came out in October. That's what happens in that story. Now, the question therefore becomes, to what extent is John a product of the Sandman universe? Pretty much all that matters when he drops back into 2019 London is that he has in his mind the notion that Timothy Hunter might one day grow up to be a monster. So inasmuch as this bothers the Hellblazer book, that doesn't really matter at all. But just to mention, Books of Magic issue 14, which also comes out today, features the moment that, having arrived back in London, John Constantine tracks down Timothy Hunter and confronts him and says to him, are you going to grow up to be a monster, or are you going to grow up to be a decent kid? And tests him to find out the answer to that. So to come back to your question about world building, there are tentacles of wider continuity if you want to find them. But I have always taken the view that continuity should be a bonus to the veteran reader rather than an obstacle to the rookie. So you don't need to know this stuff. You don't need to go looking for it. You should be able to enjoy Hellblazer 1 and onwards on its own terms. So that said, the only world building that you really need is to start from a position of John exists in a world that is recognizably our own. So Trump is in charge in the US, Boris Johnson's in charge in the UK, the world is slowly going to the dogs. It's a time of fear and poverty and prejudice. Nobody really knows what the fuck is going on. And then you can go looking for myth and magic and darkness and ghost stories and just fill every shadow with something strange and hauntological. And that's kind of the fertile ground in which Hellblazer stories exist.
Yeah, speaking of your prime minister, I believe I saw a cameo.
I can confirm.
Yeah. Due to the very strict libel laws they have over, sure you can't say anything about that. But so speaking of, continuity, it's so cool that you're able to kind of have the license to do what you want to with the continuity that you want to deal with. Speaking of drowning in a heavy mass of continuity, you wrote for the X-Men.
Yeah.
How was that, man? Because X-Men Legacy, that was such... I love that run. I thought it was amazing.
It's sort of it's a really good question. I guess the answer is I cheated. I happened to start from a position of telling a story about a character. This is Legion, David Haller, for those who don't know, the character who recently featured as the protagonist of the Noah Hawley TV show Legion. They asked me to do a solo book about that character, and for those who aren't in the know, the character had previously been used as a sort of walking, talking plot point. He was the most powerful mutant who ever existed, but also tormented by split personalities and multiple layers of mental unhealth. And I sort of, well, apart from anything else, the reason that I adore that series, that I'm so proud of it, is that we deliberately leaned into the fact that it was a story about somebody whose own worst enemy was himself, and who tried to deal with the problems that he faced as a result of his own mental unwellness, rather than a story about a crazy, powerful mutant who's also a bit mad. And I mean, you don't need me to tell you, mutantism has been used as a metaphor for all sorts of things. And so using it as a metaphor for one's capacity to control or not one's own self was really great. And there isn't a comic convention I've been to so far where somebody hasn't come up to me with tears in their eyes and said that story inspired them to kind of find the strength to help themselves in the midst of some really dark places. So I'm really proud of that.
You should be, because the I rule me thing is such a great way to think about stuff like that. It's really fantastic.
It's always lovely, and people often, I mean, there have been people who come up to me and say, dude, this book saved me, and they're wrong, because nothing saves you except yourself. You know, if you are saved, it's because you found the strength to save yourself. And it's humbling and wonderful that book has inspired and at least helped people along that path. But I claim no credit for people being saved, because it's all down to people. But one of the happy upshots of telling a story about one of the most powerful mutants in the world, who's off on his own and dealing with some pretty weird stuff, was that I really didn't have to worry too much about continuity. And to the extent, in fact, that by the end of the run, without spoiling it, I sort of quite perversely found a way to make the story end on such a note that you couldn't undo it unless you were prepared to just play fast and loose with continuity, which they kind of did eventually. So yeah, it was an exercise in character and a kind of flying in the face of the notion of a shared world, rather than playing along with it, because that felt so true to the character's psyche. You know, he's been outcast and abused and exploited and put in the corner by pretty much everybody, hero or villain, that he's ever encountered. So it felt really nice to just tell a story about this kid who was going, you know what, fuck you all, I'm going to do my thing, and I've got the power to do it. And the only enemy I really have is myself. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. So continuity didn't really bother me very much.
That's awesome. And man, those Mike Del Mundo covers were,
right?
Oh my God. That was fantastic. Do you know if Hickman, like I honestly, I've not really kept up with the Hickman run. Do you know if he really brought any of that into the, into what he's doing now, and do you have any idea of do you have any thoughts about what's going on now in the X-Men world?
In as much as the Legion stuff, I don't think he's brought it through. I have to be very careful at what I say here for fear of treading on my own toes. So let me boil it down to say I think he's doing some very, very exciting and interesting stuff. And it's well overdue, and I look forward to seeing where it goes.
Awesome. And also the Legion show, did they really take anything from your run?
Nothing that was recognizably direct. I think that I know for a fact they all read it because I've been told that. I think that a lot of the thematic stuff would have not been in that show if it weren't for the book. And they've been extremely generous. Like, I got a credit at the end of the first episode, for instance, to thank me for the contribution to the canon. So it would be disingenuous to say that it was an adaptation of my work, because it's not. It's its own thing. I love it, by the way. I think it's really cool. But it's funny, I mean, to kind of link it back to something we were talking about earlier on. I think it's possible to enjoy, on their own terms, two totally different versions of the same character. So, for instance, I never read it, but I'm told that the more recent comic book that was by Peter Milligan, which focuses on the same character, on Legion, is also very good. But I assume, because I was so perverse and bloody-minded about the way I tied up my run on X-Men Legacy, I assumed that they've just sort of kick-started from scratch and not had to worry about unentangling my deliberately entangled continuity. So I think that we, as readers, worry about this stuff at our peril, because it can end up consuming us and being the point rather than just enjoying the stories on their own terms.
Awesome. And so you got your start in UK comics. You got to write some Judge Dredd comics. How was that experience? Because he's such a huge icon over there and starting to get recognized here. I'm really excited about the new release they're doing next year.
Books, yeah.
Yes.
It'd be great. It's a chance for the US market to kind of check out some of the really wonderful, creative, inventive, cynical, dark, very punky comics that 2000 AD have been doing for such a long time. It was the first comic I ever read, 2000 AD. I found it when I was about 16, and it kind of gave me that epiphany that a lot of comics readers have had, that these are not just artifacts that fall fully formed from the sky. They are artistic texts which are created by teams of people, writers, artists, letterers, colorists, editors, the whole caboodle. And it kind of immediately triggered in me the desire to work in this world myself. Holy shit, writing comics, that's a job that you can do. I want to do that. That's a thing I want. So yeah, I just spent years and years as a teenager sending in submissions, generally pretty terrible submissions, and eventually one day realized that I wasn't going to get anywhere until I started actually paying attention to the advice that the editors were being kind enough to respond to me with in their rejection letters. And as soon as I sort of did that, I got a gig, and it was 2008 does this little things called the Future Shocks. This is where Alan Moore got his start, believe it or not. So little 4 or 5 page one-shot sci-fi stories with a twist in the tail. And if you can do that, if you can tell a satisfying story that surprises and has some sort of moral resonance in a dense dollop of 4 or 5 pages like that, then anything else is kind of easy after that. So yeah, that's how I got my start, and it's kind of worked its way through various different places and ports of call and vibes and genres. Like a lot of so for instance, I do a lot of creator-owned work with Boom Studios. It's one of my favorite publishers, and that's probably where the work I do is the most akin to the sort of punky vibe that I first had when I came to work at 2000 AD. So I did a book called Coda, which is a sort of Mad Max meets Lord of the Rings. I did a book called Six Gun Gorilla, which is an insane science fiction western set in an alternate world. In fact, the latest thing I'm doing, which is out in spring of 2020, is a book called Alienated, with an incredible artist called Chris Wagoose. And the point of Alienated is it's a sort of very twisted take on E.T. I've been pitching it as E.T. meets Heathers. So it starts with these 3 outcast teenagers blundering upon a hyper powerful alien god creature in the woods one day and accidentally using it to murder a bully, and then hijinks ensue. so that's the sort of hyper black comedy, cynical but extremely inventive stuff that you expect from 2000 AD, and it's been part of my career, bubbling under all the way through, even into the X-Men stuff and the Constantine stuff.
So you were talking a little about your creator-owned items you do with Boom, but you've also written some novels. Do you have anything that you're working on right now?
Not right now, and that's a real pain in my heart, because I always expected to be doing a little bit of prose and a little bit of comics and a little bit of other things. But there's just no time in the day, you know, as you and I discussed before we started recording.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a little baby in my life now, so my time is not my own.
What is your schedule for writing?
Oh, it's pretty tight. It's sort of, I start at 8, finish at 6. I hope to have a kind of an hour or so in the middle of the day to hang out with the baby, and then as soon as I'm off mic, I'm helping his mum with him, because my wife is an exceptional graphic designer in her own right. In fact, her name's Emma Price. She's done a lot of logos and cover dress and design for sorts of great Image titles and DC titles. So she's busy too. So we don't have any spare time. And if you've any experience of writing prose, you know that one of the biggest things that you need in order to be able to write novels is not just talent and not just ideas, but you need tenacity and grit and just the time to sit and keep hammering your head against the keyboard until you're bleeding from every orifice, and then eventually one day you might have a completed story. So I'm itching to get back to it, but my comics schedule is extremely punishing, and I've got lots of kind of exciting TV and movie stuff kind of bubbling away as well, which I have to dedicate some time to as well. So prose just doesn't get a look in at the moment, but I'm hoping to change that very soon.
I was recently telling my 9-year-old that she was having trouble with something she was working on. She's like the creative type kid, and I love it, but she was getting frustrated, and I told her, when you're creative, it's throwing yourself up against a wall until you eventually break through. You're gonna get frustrated, but it's about being able to keep going.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, it's thin skin, bloody-minded tenacity and determination. And one thing that so many people who want to write in whatever medium don't realize when they start is that it doesn't have to be good. You have to just get the thing done. Once you've got it done, that's when you sit down and you go back and you noodle with it and you fiddle with it and you rewrite and you rewrite and you rewrite and you rewrite. And eventually, it's great. But nobody ever just sat down at a desk and hammered out a perfect, beautiful, shining nugget of literary brilliance. And so an awful lot of people, when they first start, they'll spend all day write something, and then they'll do the classic mistake, which is to read it. And you should never read your own work. You should just get the thing finished. Spend as long as you need. Start the next day at exactly the point you finished the day before. Do not go back and reread it. Eventually, you'll have a novel, and it's probably terrible, but at least you've got a novel, and then you can go back and make it good. And that's true with comics, and it's true with a TV script, it's true with a movie script. You just have to get the damn thing done, because to stop and to check your own work is just to invite self-analysis, and self-analysis invites nothing but self-loathing. That's
words to live by for anybody in the creative field. So I noticed the big thing on Twitter lately has been people talking about piracy and ways to prevent that, and it really is an issue with comics and just creative things, entertainment in general. What could you see the comics industry doing better to confront this?
Oh heavens, that's a really good and big question, and I'm afraid I'm not the best person to ask. I don't know. I mean, there's a reason I'm a writer rather than an editor or a distributor. My very vague sense, in a kind of I've had 3 pints and I'm being brilliant down the pub because I've got theories kind of way, which you should really take with a pinch of salt, is that an awful lot of the problems facing Western comics in particular, and I draw the distinction because you can learn an awful lot from European comics or Eastern manga that would probably help our particular situation in the West. But my sense is that an awful lot of our problems can be ultimately boiled down to the egregious way that the direct market works. And to give you an example of that, let's pretend for a second that you are a comic store owner. You're a retailer. Because of the way that the distribution model works, you have something like 4 days between issues of a comic to decide how many copies of the next issue you're going to order in for your stock. And if you get it wrong badly, like 1 week, you're in trouble. If you get it wrong badly 2 weeks in a row, you're probably out of business because these guys are not making a huge profit. There is no margin of error. And so it follows that in order to avoid the risk that comes from getting it so badly wrong that you go out of business, comics retailers are obliged to be quite conservative about their tastes, what they expect, and what they want. In other words, they will only order heavy on books that they know really, really well, really confidently will do extremely well, extremely good business for them. So something new, something weird, something different, they're probably going to be a little bit averse to giving it a punt. So if you program that setup into your creative matrix, it follows that writers, artists, and especially publishers are going to help the retailers out by giving them what they want, which is basically the same stuff over and over and over and over again. Because they want things that are going to be predictable. They want things that they know how many people are going to buy it. They want things that aren't going to cause them to have to take a risk. So I would draw a very tentative direct line between the direct market, the distribution model, and the prevalence in today's Western market of the perpetual, ongoing, second act superheroes with their shared universes where everything relates to everything else, to the constant redropping of new issue number ones because everybody loves a number one and it helps the retailers to shift a bunch of copy without taking any risk.
And I'm sure that leads to audience fatigue.
Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, maybe that's probably right. I mean, there's an argument that says that having identified that that's what works, we're now in a situation where we're doing a little bit too much. You know, there's probably too many titles on the shelves to sustain the readership that we have, and that's why we need to really be going out there and building new readerships, which we're doing. But there's a lot of resistance to that because the people who've always been served by comics don't want to believe that they are having it prized out of their hands. And of course, you and I know they're not. You can build new readerships without offending the old readership, but it's very difficult for some people to see an increase in other areas as not being persecution in their own area. But yeah, I think when it comes to piracy, I think that the distribution model has caused, I mean, to use your own term, if you assume there is some level of fatigue in the audience, and if you feel like you've got to schlep all the way to a comic store to buy something that you've seen before, and it costs quite a lot of money because we have this monopoly at the core of the distribution model, so we can really choose whatever price point we want, then yeah, I'm just going to get it for free, because why wouldn't I? How do you deal with that? You probably get the publishers to be a little more draconian about stamping down on it, and you probably need to find ways to provide some carrot as well as some stick. I don't know why digital comics have to be the same price as print comics. I think that things like the subscription models that DC and Marvel both have now are really good steps in the right direction. I think that Comixology is going to, I mean, I've been saying this for years, but I think they're actually now doing some really exciting stuff which is going to transform the medium. But I have no answer. Piracy is literally killing comics. And I say that with great seriousness and earnestness because if a comic drops below a certain threshold, then it gets cancelled. And then you go onto one of these pirate websites and you see how many people have read that comic, and it's probably twice as many as bought it.
Oh, yeah.
And those people are like, oh, I love this comic. It was the best thing ever. But, dude, you literally killed the comic because you didn't spend any money on it.
Yeah, and it's not just DC or Marvel that are, dependent on this comic. It's the creators, and you guys work really, really hard on these things.
Yeah.
From the top to the bottom. I absolutely
understand. I can even quietly sympathize with the people who cannot afford to buy all the comics they love. But it's no different from not being able to afford the food you love, or the clothes you love, or the car you love. We all live in a world where we make compromises. This is one of the unpleasant truths of living in a capitalist society, is that you don't get to have everything all the time, and you shouldn't have the chance to get everything all the time because that kills everybody else. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know it's unsustainable as it currently is.
I just wish they'd bring back spinner racks. That was the best. And that's what got me into comics, was going to the grocery store. Mom, more than happy enough to let me fuck off and leave her alone while I'm at the spinner rack trying to pick out what I want that week. So, I mean, it was a great way to introduce new readers, and I think that's what we desperately need.
I think you're right, and I think, well, part of the problem there is that we all feel quite legitimately that we need to find a solution that pays its dues and its loyal obligations to the comic store retailers, because they are heroes. They're on the front line. They're taking these risks every week. They're doing great under extremely difficult circumstances, and all the risk in the industry has been dumped onto their heads. So how do you, for me, the question is not so much how do you get comics under new people's eyes. There are multiple ways of doing that, and we should be better at that, to your point. But the bigger question is, how do you encourage people to start forming communities around comic book stores so that they have safe places to talk about stuff that they love without feeling niche or judged or bullied or excluded from some sort of mainstream discourse? There's a whole bunch of really big socioeconomic stuff which is swirling around and around this question, which isn't as simple as it seems. And I come back to, I'm not the right person to try and answer this question, but something's got to be changed.
So let's start right here. Where's your favorite LCS? Or do you have any?
I have two, actually. I'm very lucky. So we just moved out of London, but there are two in town. We have a great store called Gosh. We have a great store called Orbital. And there is a third mega store, which is a Planet mega store. And they all kind of serve their own strengths. And the staff in them are extremely helpful and extremely welcoming. And I remember when I started getting into comics that to go into an LCS was to descend into a gloomy little dungeon where you felt like you were probably going to encounter a porno rack at the back of it or something, and it didn't feel welcoming to anybody who just happened to be strolling past. And I think we're well beyond that now. I think we're in a world of big windows and lots of light and friendly people of all shapes and sizes and colors being extremely welcoming in these stores. So hurrah for that. I just think that the monolithic distribution setup is probably costing all of us a lot more than it's helping. And I can't say more than that because I'm no expert, but I sense instinctively that there is something wrong with the system that has a monopoly at its core, and things will probably be better if there were more competition in the distribution setup.
Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah. So we're almost. I don't want to take up any more of your day than is needed. I'm sure you have a ton of writing to do. Do you have anything you want to leave us with?
Oh, just that I really do have a ton of writing. It's quite lovely to not be doing it, but no, just do please check out Hellblazer, because I think it's really good. I think it's a return to a character that we've desperately needed in our lives, as a counterpoint to some of the more kind of Manichean heroism that we see on the big shared universes. Keep an eye out for Alienated, which is out next year, because I think it's wonderful that people are so excited in today's world by big shared universe comics. But the more we can support creator-owned and indie comics, the more the industry will continue to thrive beyond the big two. And just keep your eyes open for some really cool stuff that I'm announcing quite soon, which I'm just not allowed to talk about. Hey,
that's fine. And in the spring when Alienated comes out, by all means, give us a holler. We'll be more than happy to talk about it with you on the show. Man, that Aaron Campbell art in the Hellblazer, oh my goodness. Is fantastic, and I didn't catch your colorist and letterer, but everybody's just hitting all cylinders.
Thank you. Well, for the record, colorist is Geordie Belair, who is exceptional, and the letterer is Aditya Bidikar, who is also one of the up and coming geniuses of our industry. So yeah, we've got an absolutely cracking team.
Really fantastic stuff. There's one panel in particular that hit me hard, and it's just the body language of Constantine. He has the most sad dog look on his face ever. And you kind of get the weight of what's just happened in the story. And it's like, oh, wow.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, Aaron is a long-term Constantine fan, as am I. So, I mean, literally the best that any writer can say of their artist is he gets it. And this guy gets it. So I'm sort of ridiculously privileged to be working with such a great team.
Dude, Si, I'm really looking forward to this run, and I can't wait to pick up issue 2. So
thank you so much, Casey.
All right, well, thanks again, and thank you guys for coming back to Spoiler Country.
Cheerio. I don't know if he ever says that,
No,
but you know,
I don't know. That's like the total American way to go to an English accent.
Cheerio, mate.
Cheerio, mate.
Which I don't know how well that sounds. It probably sounds
Probably sounds
stupid.
like shit.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Bunch of racist bastards here.
I'm not just saying you. Well, we hope you guys really enjoyed that.
Yeah,
That
it was great.
a lot of fun.
I had so much fun on the interview.
Did you?
Now listen to it.
All right, guys. Hope you guys really enjoyed that. Don't forget to open the mind.
You read more. See ya.
It's so weird that now you have to do all that more as well.
I'm sorry about that. My capacity to deal with technology at the best of times, but in the morning especially. So thank you, Casey. I feel like I'm half dead because it's early in the morning, so I can barely imagine how exhausted you must be. So this is really good of you. Thank you.
Oh, it's no problem at all. My day normally starts around about 4:30, so it's not too far off. So.
Sounds appalling to me. Well, this all came about because I, being a disaster, totally forgot that I had this call set up last week. So you've saved my bacon.
Oh, it's man. Let me pull up. I have some notes and all that other good stuff. So, how you doing, man?
Very good. As discussed, slightly ruined. All of the disaster and schedule decay that is currently in my life is pretty. I'm having a little 16-month-old son, and after 16 months, you would think that we would be slightly more on top of how disruptive he is. But,
yeah, I know that's bullshit. I have 2 kids, and yeah, it's chaos all the way down, man. So
every time we put our hands on it, something else comes down the pipe and ruins everything. So,
is it your first?
Yes, he is.
You will learn to thrive on chaos. Like there's no other way to explain it. It'll get easier. But yeah, I totally understand that. Actually, I was thinking about this earlier. You have some connection with Doctor Who. I think your significant other
recently, yeah.
That when I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. When my 9-year-old was born, I had just gotten into Doctor Who, and I had gotten the DVDs. And you have a lot of late nights when you have a kid, so if baby would wake up in the middle of the night, daddy and baby would go to the living room and watch some Doctor Who until she fell asleep. That was what got me through the early months.
Very good. Getting them started on the Geek Fest early on, I approve thoroughly.
Oh yeah. And what's even more silly is my 4-year-old. We were at the doctor. Her GI doctor is a lady. She has blonde hair, and she asked her if she was Doctor Who.
That's wonderful.
So
that's really good.
But let me go ahead and do an intro, and we'll get this party started. All right?
Sounds good.